Somewhere in a sealed-off lab at MIT, 54 people sat down to write an essay. They wore headsets wired to track 32 regions of the human brain. Some of them wrote with nothing but their own minds. Some used a search engine, and some used ChatGPT. When the researchers looked at the scans afterward, one group's brains had gone almost dark, quiet, disconnected. The memory centers, the attention centers, the regions responsible for creative reasoning, all of it dimmed, like a city losing power one block at a time. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. When those same people were asked minutes later to recite even one line from the essay they had just finished writing, 83% of them could not do it. They had produced the words. They simply hadn't produced the thought. That is where this story begins. Not with a panic about lazy students, but with hard evidence that something measurable is happening inside the human brain the moment we hand our thinking over to a machine, and that something doesn't just affect students. It affects all of us. This is the AI Ledger, and tonight we're going inside the research that nobody wants to slow down long enough to actually read. Because somewhere between the headlines screaming that college students are forgetting how to read and the skeptics rolling their eyes and saying, this is just moral panic dressed up in lab coats, there is a real data-backed, deeply uncomfortable story about what artificial intelligence is doing to human cognition. Not someday, right now. And it isn't confined to a classroom in Ohio or a dorm room at Yale. It reaches into offices, hospitals, courtrooms, and eventually into the bedrooms of children who haven't even learned to multiply yet. This is a story about outsourcing the one thing that has always separated us from our tools, the act of thinking itself. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the early 2020s, when generative AI tools went from a novelty to a daily habit in the span of about 18 months. Students used them to write essays. Employees used them to draft emails. Within a few years, large language models weren't a curiosity anymore. They were infrastructure, as ordinary and invisible as electricity. And like electricity, almost nobody stopped to ask what it was doing to the system it was now running through. That MIT study, formerly titled Your Brain on ChatGPT, became the first real attempt to look under the hood. It's still a preprint, meaning it hasn't gone through full peer review, and a sample size of 54 people is small by any scientific standard. Critics have already raised methodological concerns. But here's the part that should make even the skeptics lean in. The signal lines up with study after study that followed it. And in a later session of that same experiment, researchers took the ChatGPT group and asked them to write again, this time without any AI assistance at all. Their brain activity did not bounce back. The neural engagement that should have returned when the tool was taken away simply didn't. It was as if the brain had quietly filed away the instruction, "We don't do that part anymore," and refused to reverse it. If the MIT study was the spark, the Carnegie Mellon and Microsoft research published at the CHI conference was the structural fire behind it. Peer-reviewed, methodologically sound, and far harder to wave away. Researchers tracked 319 knowledge workers across nearly 1,000 real AI-assisted tasks, and they found a pattern that should worry every manager, every professional, every person who has ever typed a question into a chatbot mid-workday. The more confidence a worker placed in the AI's competence, the less critical thinking they applied to its output. People who trusted their own expertise scrutinized what the machine gave them. People who trusted the machine simply stopped checking. They weren't just letting go of the wheel. They were climbing into the back seat and trusting the vehicle to navigate rush hour traffic on its own. A follow-up study of 666 participants found something even starker. A strong negative correlation between how often someone used AI and how well they scored on critical thinking assessments. The more frequently the tool was used, the more the underlying skill eroded, and the mechanism behind that erosion had a name: cognitive offloading, the simple, human, almost instinctive habit of letting a digital tool do the mental heavy lifting so you don't have to. And before you assume this only applies to people copying and pasting essay prompts, consider a 2026 study that looked at professional software developers, skilled, experienced people, learning a brand new coding library. The ones who fully delegated the learning process to AI ended up with code that worked. But when tested on the underlying concepts, they scored 17% worse than developers who'd engaged with the material directly. They had the output without the understanding, the destination without ever learning the route. These were adults with an existing foundation of expertise, and they still lost ground. Now stretch that forward to someone encountering a subject for the very first time, with no foundation to fall back on at all, and the implications start to look very different. It would be easy at this point to declare AI guilty and move on. But the research refuses to let the story be that simple, and that's exactly where it gets interesting. One of the most cited studies claiming AI improves learning outcomes was quietly retracted last year. The evidence base, as it stands, is lopsided. The studies documenting cognitive cost are accumulating, while the studies documenting cognitive benefit are thinner, weaker, and in at least one high-profile case, simply wrong. And yet, a 2024 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found something genuinely hopeful. Students who engaged with AI critically, questioning its answers, editing its suggestions, pushing back on its reasoning rather than copying it wholesale, performed better and reported less mental fatigue than students who didn't use AI at all. The tool itself isn't the villain in this story. The way it's used is what determines whether it builds a mind or quietly replaces one. And this is the point where the narrative needs a correction, because almost every headline frames this as a youth problem. A kids these days story about lazy students and shrinking attention spans. That framing lets everyone else off the hook far too easily. The MIT participants were between 18 and 39 years old. The Carnegie Mellon workers were full-grown professionals with careers and mortgages. The cognitive offloading data comes from working adults navigating ordinary jobs. This is not a generational defect. It's a use-it-or-lose-it phenomenon that applies to every brain on Earth, regardless of age, education, or how many academic degrees hang on the wall. And it's worth saying plainly, the world right now is exhausting. People are stretched thin, pulled in a dozen directions at once, and reaching for a tool that lightens that load isn't a moral failing. It's a deeply human response to an unforgiving pace of life. Nobody should be made to feel ashamed for letting AI draft a difficult email or summarize a dense report. The danger isn't using the tool. The danger is never noticing when the tool starts using you. There's a counter-argument worth taking seriously here, one made by commentators who point out that there was never some golden age of critical thinking before AI showed up to ruin it. National assessment scores have been flat for decades. Long before ChatGPT existed, large studies of college students found many of them were academically adrift, gaining startlingly little in actual reasoning ability across 4 years of higher education. In that light, AI didn't destroy critical thinking so much as it exposed a foundation that was already cracked. There's real truth in that argument, but it cuts the opposite way from how it's often used. It isn't a reason for complacency, it's a reason for urgency. If critical thinking skills were already fragile before this technology arrived, then handing people an even easier way to avoid exercising those skills isn't neutral. It's pouring water on a fire that was already struggling to stay lit. So what happens when you take the tool away entirely? A teacher in Minneapolis ran an unintentional experiment that answers that question almost too perfectly. She banned every piece of technology from her advanced placement literature classroom, phones, laptops, everything, and went back to pencil and paper. In September, less than half her students said they felt confident in their reading ability. By February, after months of friction, resistance, and eventual adjustment, that number had nearly doubled. A separate study out of Wharton on college phone bans found that the students who benefited most weren't the high achievers. It was the struggling students and first-year students still forming their study habits who saw the steepest gains, in some cases nearly double the average improvement. Removing the tool, even temporarily, seemed to rebuild a muscle that had quietly atrophied. But removing it permanently isn't a realistic solution either, not in a world where this technology is now woven into how research, work, and communication function. Where this conversation turns genuinely serious is with children. There's a distinction here that deserves far more attention than it currently gets, and one researcher put it about as starkly as it can be put. Adults who offload their thinking to AI are losing a capacity they spent years building. Children may never build that capacity in the first place. When a brain that hasn't yet formed its own independent reasoning pathways is handed a tool that reasons for it, the AI isn't competing with an existing skill, it's replacing the development of that skill before it ever has a chance to form. At Yale, a student described to a national news outlet how classroom discussions had become flat and oddly uniform, recalling a classmate typing furiously into a laptop, feeding the professor's own questions straight into an AI chatbot in real time. "Everyone kind of sounds the same," she said. And that's the unsettling part. When a generation of students processes information through the same underlying model, the sameness isn't just in vocabulary or sentence structure. It's in the reasoning itself. The model's logic becomes their logic. Its blind spots become their blind spots. And nobody yet has a clean answer for where the line should be drawn. Is it fine for a small child to spend hours talking to an AI companion about cartoons? Is that enrichment? Or is it outsourcing the very development of curiosity and reasoning to a system designed primarily to keep them engaged? Consider a study from 2017 that found something deceptively simple. Just having a smartphone nearby, turned off, face down, untouched, was enough to measurably reduce a person's available cognitive capacity. The device didn't need to buzz or light up. Its mere presence was enough to quietly occupy a slice of working memory. If an inert phone can do that to a fully developed adult brain, it's worth asking, soberly, what a constantly available, endlessly patient AI companion might be doing to a mind that is still learning how to think in the first place. Governments have started to notice. The United Kingdom recently announced a ban on social media access for anyone under 16. Snapchat, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, X, all of it, going even further than Australia's landmark restrictions from the year before. Roughly 20 US states now restrict phone use during the school day. France, Spain, Greece, Slovenia, and South Korea have introduced or are actively developing similar limits. It took the better part of a decade of accumulating evidence about what unregulated social media does to a developing mind before regulation finally caught up. The early data suggests AI's cognitive footprint may move along that same trajectory, only faster, because the mechanism is more direct. Social media was built to capture attention. AI, by its very design, captures the thinking process itself. A Rand Corporation survey from earlier this year found that 70% of students themselves believe AI is eroding their own critical thinking. And that concern jumped sharply among high schoolers in a single year. When the people living through something are the ones sounding the alarm and the alarm is getting louder, that's not anecdote, that's data. Notably, the UK's technology minister specifically flagged AI chatbots as a distinct concern from social media, pointing out that children were forming one-on-one emotional relationships with systems that were never designed with a child's safety or development in mind. So what's the actual fix here? Because banning AI outright from education feels like fighting the tide, and leaving access completely unrestricted feels like watching a fire spread and calling it weather. The deeper issue may not be the technology itself, but how indiscriminately it's being deployed. Human knowledge keeps expanding. Every field requires more years of study to reach competence than it did a generation ago, while the length of a human career stays roughly fixed. Tools that help people navigate, synthesize, and make sense of that expanding mountain of information aren't a luxury. They're becoming a genuine necessity in research, in medicine, in science, in education. The problem isn't that powerful tools exist. The problem is that we're currently using one undifferentiated tool for every single purpose imaginable. The same general-purpose chatbot fielding a postdoctoral researcher's question about particle physics and a 12-year-old's first attempt at algebra with no meaningful distinction between the two. This is where the real opportunity sits, and it's less a prediction than a vision worth taking seriously. Instead of pouring resources into bolting safety filters and content warnings onto general-purpose chatbots after the fact, what if serious investment flowed toward building specialized tools designed around how people actually learn? Picture an educational AI built on the Socratic method, a system that, when a student asks what caused a historical revolution, doesn't hand over a tidy paragraph, but instead asks what the student already knows about the economic and political conditions beforehand, building on their answer, correcting misconceptions, filling gaps, but never simply serving the finished dish before the student has done any of the cooking. That's a fundamentally different relationship with knowledge than a tool whose only goal is delivering the fastest possible answer. Early versions of this already exist. Khan Academy's AI Tutor is one notable example, but they remain a tiny fraction of the AI landscape compared to the general-purpose giants soaking up the lion's share of investment, research attention, and deployment urgency. The same logic extends to medicine, where a clinically specific AI built with appropriate safeguards looks very different from a general chatbot answering health questions, and to research, where a tool built for verification and synthesis serves a different purpose than one built to generate plausible-sounding text. People also don't learn identically. Visual learners, hands-on learners, verbal processors, social learners, and a single one-size-fits-all chatbot was never going to serve all of them equally well. The research is consistent on one point. Critical engagement, questioning a tool rather than blindly accepting its output, is what actually builds cognitive strength. So the obvious next step is building systems that demand that kind of engagement by design, rather than ones that quietly reward passivity. None of this happens without better incentives, and that's ultimately the deeper story underneath all of it. What's needed now isn't another 50-person study running for a few months. It's hundreds of large-scale longitudinal studies tracking real cognitive development across diverse populations over years, not weeks. Studies that separate passive consumption from active engagement. Studies that account for different learning styles and neurological profiles. Studies funded and prioritized with the same urgency currently reserved for making models faster, cheaper, and more capable. The research infrastructure to do this exists. What's missing is the will to fund it before the damage becomes irreversible rather than after. So where does this leave us? Back at that headline about college students losing the ability to read, a headline that turns out to be both true and incomplete. AI is measurably changing how the human brain engages with information, and the costs of using it indiscriminately are real, documented, and especially dangerous for minds still in the process of forming. But the same research shows just as clearly that AI used critically, as a sparring partner rather than a shortcut, can sharpen thinking instead of dulling it. The difference between those two outcomes was never really about the technology. It's about design, deployment, and intention. We watched this exact pattern play out with social media. A technology with genuine potential to connect people, deployed instead to maximize engagement at almost any cognitive cost, and it took roughly a decade of mounting harm before governments finally acted. We are standing at an earlier point on what looks like the same curve with artificial intelligence, except this time we already have the pattern in front of us. The only open question is whether we act on what the research is already telling us, or whether we wait for the evidence to pile up until the headlines get worse than the one we started with tonight. Because the choice in front of us isn't really AI or no AI. It's whether we build machines that make human minds sharper, or whether we quietly let them make the decisions while we forget how to think at all. The most unsettling part of this story isn't that artificial intelligence is becoming smarter. It's that we may be becoming less willing to do the work of thinking for ourselves. For centuries, every major technological leap has forced humanity to answer the same question. Does this tool expand human capability, or slowly replace it? The printing press changed how we stored knowledge. The internet changed how we accessed it. And now AI is changing how we interact with it altogether. The research we've explored tonight doesn't suggest that artificial intelligence is inherently dangerous. It suggests something more complicated, more uncomfortable, that the future outcome depends on us. Because every time we ask an AI to think for us, we make a choice. Sometimes that choice saves time. Sometimes it improves productivity. Sometimes it's exactly the right decision. But if we stop questioning, stop verifying, stop struggling with difficult ideas, stop exercising the mental muscles that create understanding in the first place, then the cost may not become visible immediately. It may take years, a generation of students, an entire workforce, or perhaps an entire society that slowly forgets the difference between knowing something and simply receiving an answer. The technology is moving forward either way. The only real question is whether human cognition moves forward with it. If we get this right, AI could become one of the greatest educational and intellectual tools ever created, a system that amplifies human intelligence, accelerates discovery, and helps people learn faster than any generation before them. If we get it wrong, we may discover that the easiest way to solve a problem is also the fastest way to stop learning how to solve it ourselves. And by the time we realize what we've traded away, rebuilding those cognitive skills may be far harder than losing them. The warning signs are here. The research is growing. The debate has begun. Now comes the part that matters most. What kind of relationship do we want with the machines we're creating? One that challenges us to think, or one that quietly thinks in our place? That's a question no AI can answer for us. Only humans can. This has been the AI Ledger. If you enjoyed this investigation, subscribe for more deep dives into the technologies reshaping our future. And if you have thoughts on where the line should be drawn between AI assistance and AI dependence, let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and most importantly, keep thinking.